Hello, everyone, and welcome. Just to start out, I wanted to apologize. During our live presentations, we had some technical difficulties, and so there were a few there was a gap between my initial introduction to the seminar and then also introducing some of our first speakers. And I just wanted to make sure that everyone knows that that even though there were a few slides that were missed during Dr. Traster's presentation, I just want everyone to know that we will be posting the PowerPoints provided by all the presenters during the live performance. So let's go ahead and get started. Just a little bit about Synapse as an organization. So Synapse at the U of O is a student-run organization, and we are a local chapter of Synapse National, which is a nonprofit organization that is helping to bring awareness to the brain-injured community. Our purpose is to serve, support, and advocate for local brain injury survivors in the Springfield and Eugene area. We help organize and foster opportunities and programs for community members as a way to combat social isolation and increase awareness for the brain injury community. Through peer support programs, social events, and educational webinar and symposium series such as this one, we hope to create long-lasting and meaningful connections and encouragement for the brain injury community. As advocates for individuals living with brain injury, we here at Synapse at the U of O are so grateful you decided to join us for our live presentations, and also that you sought out the information after the fact. And we also want to send out a huge thank you to all of our wonderful guest speakers, as well as our amazing lived experience with brain injury panelists who presented and shared their stories. Just really quickly, I do want to send out a message. Also within Springfield and Eugene, there are a lot of groups in our community that are actively working to help individuals who live with brain injury. Whitebird Clinic is one of them. Whitebird Clinic is a collective environment organized to enable people to gain control of their social, emotional, and physical well-being through direct service, education, and community. Part of our goal today is to raise funds for the critical resources for the brain injury community, such as Whitebird Clinic, and we highly encourage and request that you consider donating to them. And then just really quickly, during the actual live presentation, I had the opportunity to introduce one of our organizers for this series and a past webinar, who is a vital and much appreciated part of Synapse, or our chapter of Synapse. And so I do want to, pay dues to him and make sure that I am able to introduce him correctly. So thank you, Daniel. Daniel came to us as a peer support group member, living and sharing about his experiences with brain injury. But over the course of the year, he has become an integral part of our team, helping to promote better awareness of the subtleties and variants of experiences that come with acquired brain injury. He also has played a crucial role in our conferences development, and we will be collaborating with him on some more awareness and science dissemination projects in the future. So thank you, Daniel. And then next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Traster. Dr. Traster is a globally recognized expert in the field of neurological rehabilitation. He will share his unique perspective on the use of functional neurology. Dr. Traster lectures and consults for doctors of all specialties across the world relating to patients with a variety of neurological disorders. He is most noted for working with patients suffering from head injuries, dizziness, balance disorders, and chronic pain. So without further ado, I introduce Dr. Traster from the live presentation. Thank you so much.
Relate to different areas of the brain. And so an old school thinking was, if you have cognitive issues, you need to do cognitive therapies. If you have balance issues, you need to do balance therapies. And while we do that, I think what is also necessary is to understand that different areas or different functions communicate with many areas of the brain. And what we like to do is use therapies for one function to actually improve a separate function. and it's called multisensory processing. And so we like to do eye movement therapy, balance therapy, cognitive therapy, aerobic therapy, all different types of therapies to integrate in the brain specifically. And they have a crossover, to back to your question, to improve cognition. So we can do therapies with someone's body and different exercises that have nothing to do with cognition and improve cognition, because the brain is so multisensory that one therapy alone can actually correlate to other functions. So it's 12:32, so I don't want to take time from somebody else.
Thank
I
you
think it's
so
okay.
much. Oh,
I'm next, and I think it's okay because I'm also might run over. We have an hour. Well, I think it's all right. I was gonna ask you, do you guys promote the use of exercise? I think for me, exercise has been found to have a tremendous amount of neurotrophic benefits for, regaining that plasticity when we need things to be reconnecting. So I was wondering if you guys promote that. I think in my recovery, if I hadn't been exercising the way I normally did, and I kind of do that just for my own habits and needs, I think it would have been a much harder recovery.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at, everyone could talk very detailed about the brain and health, but the reality is there's two things that have really been shown over and over again to be beneficial for your health in general. And that's exercise, and that's a Mediterranean diet, right? And there's tons of diet. Not everyone responds great to different diets, but really those are the two things you could take to the bank that research over and over again continues to show benefits. What I would say about exercise, especially after concussion, is you want it to be graded, meaning that a lot of our patients try jumping in too quickly and want to go back to their old workouts too quickly.
Right.
And you really want to make sure that you have a combination of good aerobic exercise and good strength exercise if you can. We do, even a lot of our patients with dysautonomia, we'll recommend like Pilates. So they're lying down at first and they're not upright. Like a lot of people like squats and jumping, things they used to do are just too much. And so there's a test called the Buffalo Treadmill test. And there's also a Buffalo cycling test. And what it does is kind of a graded assessment that's being used more and more. And what it shows, it kind of looks at your heart rate and it looks at your exertion and your symptoms. And it kind of gives you a marker of when you start to break down. And we like to start exercising underneath that marker and slowly gradual increase it. Because when you, back to your point, I mean, when you look at neurogenesis, like making new brain cells, exercise is really the only thing that really shows consistently a benefit. There's different chemicals, there's different things, stem cells that people are looking at. But like, especially in memory for sure, aerobic exercise is great. The question is what kind of exercise, and every type of exercise has a different type of benefit. And so we don't like to bias it. We like all types of exercises, from aerobic to strength, to eye exercises, to balanced exercises, because each type of exercise is a little different context for the brain. And when you look at the real world, I mean, we work with a lot of pro athletes, for example, and work with some of the top personal trainers. And our goal for our athletes, but for everyone, is we want to train people to move better in 360-degree space. That's our goal. So we work with a lot of pro hockey players. And when you look at a lot of pro hockey players, they've got specific movements that they do over and over again every day in the ice. And then they go to the gym, and most of their trainers do what? They put them in under loads, right? To completely replicate what they do on the ice. But then they get in the real world, and on the ice, they might do something they've never done before in a different transverse plane or a different angle. And if they always train doing the same movement, you're really limiting not just your movement, but your plasticity in your brain. And so not just players, but we look at people going through the grocery store, crossing a road. We really want people to be comfortable turning, twisting roads, right? To completely replicate what they do on the ice. But then they get in the real world, and on the ice, they might do something they've never done before in a different transverse plane or a different angle. And if they always train doing the same movement, you're really limiting not just your movement, but your plasticity in your brain. Most falls happen when people have their head backwards. But how many people are getting tested looking at their balance with their head backwards? It's usually eyes open, eyes closed, head straight. And your head position has a huge relevance to your balance. And so we do tons of therapies and assessments with different head positions, head movements, because that's when people fall. That's when people are imbalanced. And so we try to create a really rich context of environmental challenges. And then the key with like everything is doing it repetitively. It just takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. So it really comes down to finding out what your brain injury did, what areas of your brain are not as healthy as they used to be, but also what areas of your brain are really healthy. Because what we like to do is use your healthy areas to really combat and use to our advantage to improve the unhealthy areas and try to rehab those areas. And so it happens a little bit quicker that way. And it's a little more efficient to really understand what's the best type of therapy for you, but definitely exercise is great.
Yeah, I think using people's strengths is definitely positive, and I think most people don't realize how long it might take for the recovery to actually happen. It's definitely not fast.
Absolutely. And I have an opinion when you start looking at long-term consequences, when you look at the brain, and there's a slide I went through, it said you use it or lose it, right? If you don't do a function, the areas of the brain that do that function will start not getting a little lazy. And eventually, if you don't use it anymore, they're going to be gone, right? And they'll just die. And so I've got an opinion that a lot of long-term consequences of concussions are compensations in areas of the brain are just not being used anymore. And after 20, 30 years, these areas slowly degenerate. And I think it's really important to look at people, especially after brain injuries, and create these contexts to make their brains work. For example, if you're dizzy, the first comment that people make if you're dizzy and you go to the doctor is they'll tell you walk slower, right? Wait a second before you stand up. Don't turn your head as fast. And that's a good short-term advice. But if you continue living your life like that, your brain is going to get worse over time. You can take it to the bank. And a better advice would be maybe for the next week, don't do that. And let's give you therapy so you can move your head quicker, right? And so you can walk faster. Because if you continue to limit yourself and just keep adding crutches to your function, at some point, your brain is going to be really limited in your everyday function. And a lot of areas of your brain won't be working as much anymore. And I think 20, 30 years from now, that's going to lead to a lot of bad anatomy and physiology. That's going to lead to a lot of bad behavior and a lot more symptoms. And if you're more proactive, and I think that's what the research is showing more and more, the earlier you get into rehab and the more you get into exercises and therapies, the actual better the recovery long-term, where in the past it was more, let's stay in a dark room and do nothing. And let's wait until your symptoms go away. And if you come out of the dark room and you get your symptoms, let's wait longer. And I think that just was a real unfortunate scenario for a lot of people. And it led to a lot of long-term deficits and disabilities.
There's a lot of what you just spoke of. Also, I mean, I'm getting the impression, correct me if I'm wrong, that much of what you have spoken about sort of deals with the prefrontal cortex functions, if you will, the executive functions. What I'm wondering about is the reptilian brain, the substructures, the limbic system, the hippocampus, the amygdala, yada, yada, yada.
Yep.
Does the neuroplasticity that seems to occur in the prefrontal cortex happen at the same rate, the same level, the same density, the same, however you want to characterize it, I'm not sure, to the substructures?
It's a little different, but I would think about it this way, is that when you look at the brain, let's hop ahead again, because I think human beings have a poor tendency to separate things to help us understand it. And the brain,
it's an understatement.
The brain just doesn't work that way, right? And so when you look at the brain and you take a look here and you say, well, where really is the prefrontal cortex? Where is the frontal lobe? Where is the parietal lobe? Where is the occipital lobe? And you start realizing, yeah, we can cut it up. We could look at little fissures and we could say, okay, that's more there. But the fact is, it's really one big network, right? And I think we've done a good job when you look at evolutionarily of how the brain develops, of understanding these lower areas and higher areas. But the fact is when you start looking at these different areas, you start with, let's say, a lower area. So you look at, like, let's say the reptilian brain, as you're saying, right? And you start looking at these basic functions, and then you develop a higher function. So as the brain develops, it goes higher and more outside. But those higher and outer newer areas can do everything those lower areas can do, but at a higher level. And they can modify those things. And as the brain develops, they keep modifying and adding to it. And so when you start looking at the prefrontal cortex, I use the analogy with my patients all the time. And I'll tell them all the time that your brain, especially your frontal lobe, especially your prefrontal cortex, is like the boss at the job, right?
The boss at the what?
The boss at work. He's like the boss, right? If you want to run a restaurant, you need to know how, you really should need to know how to cook the food. You should know how to answer the phones. You should know how to serve tables. But if you're answering the phones, you're not doing other things that you should be doing. And so the prefrontal cortex has the ability to pretty much work with everything in the brain and really control everything in the brain, both higher and lower areas. But most of your brain should really be running autonomously, where you really shouldn't need that prefrontal cortex to be working that hard. But what you see after a brain injury is you'll see different areas of these lower areas, whether you want to call it reptilian brains, that are dysfunctional. So now the prefrontal cortex has to start doing extra work that it shouldn't be doing. And the biggest inhibition of the amygdala, for example, is your prefrontal cortex. And so if your prefrontal cortex is busy doing all these things it shouldn't be doing, your amygdala could start going crazy, and that could create anxiety, different fears, and different other emotional aspects. And so what I would say is when you start looking at the brain and segregating it, I think it's important to remember also these higher areas can do everything the lower areas can do. Now, the higher areas are more complicated. They can do more jobs, but there's plasticity in every brain cell. And so every brain cell communicates with at least 10,000 other cells, and they all have a lot of plasticity and they change all the time. And so what we see all the time is many of our concussion patients have these lower subcortical injuries with higher level compensations, where it's like they didn't injure the prefrontal cortex. Their prefrontal cortex is just trying to, and like everyone called in for work sick, right? And the boss is like running around trying to do 10 different jobs. And it's just not able, you know, it can do one thing at a time, but it's just breaking down and it's just stressed and it's just going crazy.
Overload.
Overload, exactly. And so now we definitely see people with more prefrontal injuries, and those are hard to miss. But when you start looking at people with other dysfunctions, what we see a lot of times is a lot of compensations that have never been appropriately rehabbed. And that prefrontal cortex is just overloaded. And that leads to all these secondary anxieties, stressors, etc. Now, every injury is different and unique. But like I said in the beginning, I think an unfortunate reality is a lack of assessment of these lower areas of the brain and an overemphasis of the prefrontal cortex. And so I think because most of our cognitive assessments and our psych assessments are really looking at memory, visual, spatial aspects, and really starting to look more at things that they could really score, that there's not many people, look, if you're a neuropsychologist, you're not really trained on balance, eye movements, autonomic function. A lot of times you're just not, that's not your training. And so everyone has their own kind of room. And the biggest problem with concussion is a lack of interdisciplinary communication. And it's difficult because next thing you know, you have a patient going to 10 different doctors and they're all looking at it differently. And so back to your point is I think all areas of the brain have plasticity and change. The key is assessing which ones need the most change and what therapies are going to be the most impactful to create that change.
Let me ask you something. Given what you just said about the prefrontal cortex taking over for the lower functions, the reptilian brain, if you will, how does anything in the contemplative sciences, meditation, regardless of how it's manifest, how do you see that coming into play here, or its impact, if you will?
I think
what you just said.
I think it's all relative. I think it's great, first of all, but I think it's all relative to what you're trying to do, right? And what is your purpose of meditating? How are you doing it? I think mindfulness therapies are great and meditation is great. But I think if you're trying to balance better, you're better off meditating about balancing accurately. I think there's a specificity to what you're trying to do. So I think that the problem with the brain is we still don't know that much. Like we're in like cardiology decades ago. And we're understanding more and more that there's such a mind-body, body-mind connection. And we're understanding more and more that the brain and psychology has such an influence on the body. And you can do things like mindfulness and meditation and positive thinking. And like there's a lot of research talking about 30 minutes a day of positive thinking is just as good as an antidepressant for some people. And so I think that there's a lot of benefits to that. But I think the brain's so contextual. For example, if I do therapies like an eye movement therapy while you're sitting down, and we see you have an eye movement problem, and I only treat you sitting down, it doesn't even translate to when you're standing up. So you think all of a sudden I fix your eye movement sitting down, but then you stand up and the eye movement problem could still be there because your brain is so contextual. Sitting down doing therapies is different than standing up, is different than walking.
And so, when you're driving, it is a whole nother thing. And I just want to weigh in also. No, I guess number one, to stop you because I'm worried I'm going to run over the next person.
No
and speaking after you, but I'm actually going to address that specifically because I think as patients, as the people with brain injuries, no matter how good the clinician you're working with is, they don't always know and understand what you deal with. But I'm actually going to get into specifically, and I could just jump to the slide in my talk, but I spent about a year focusing on what was wrong with me or what was missing in me through, mindfulness. And I guess through that, I at least gained much like anxiety or much like any other problem that you have, I was able to use mindfulness to sort of address it and eventually, I don't want to say get over it, but at least be able to recognize it and work with it. So I think that mindfulness, if you're focusing on relationships or anything that most people have problems with, when you have a brain injury, you can also apply that same thing, or a concussion. So yeah, I feel like I
Daniel,
might go over, and so maybe Dr. Traster will stop, and then is that okay?
yeah, so
Yeah,
this is a
good.
good time for me to be able to just kind of chime in. Just because I know that we had a schedule and there were a lot of people who know that Lily was supposed to be presenting at 11. Daniel, would you be okay if we pushed yours back to 11:30? Just so that way people that
Yeah,
are
I'm fine. I'm fine with that. The end of
Okay.
my talk introduces them, but that's okay. I got about 20 to 30 minutes of talk as well. So yeah,